"Look out!" Jim shouted, shoving Emily aside just as the man lunged for her. They tumbled to the ground, struggling against the infected man's weight. The chaos around them blurred as Emily fought to regain control, kicking and pushing with all her strength. "Get him off!" Jennings yelled, moving closer to help. Just as the sheriff reached them, the infected man turned, his mouth open in a vicious snarl, teeth bared. Jim managed to wrench free, and Jennings quickly aimed his gun. "Back! Get back!" he shouted, pulling the trigger once more. The infected man collapsed, motionless on the floor. "Is it dead?" Jim panted, staring at the body in horror. "For now," Jennings replied, scanning the area for more threats. The horde continued to press against the barricades, and Emily could hear the frantic murmurs of the remaining townsfolk outside, those who hadn't succumbed yet. "Emily, we need to organize," Mayor Hart called out, regaining her composure. "We can't just wait here. We need to plan our next move." Emily nodded, her mind racing. "We need to find a way to defend the town. We can't let this spread any further. There must be more people who haven't been infected yet. We need to warn them." Jim glanced toward the windows, his eyes filled with fear. "What if we can't get to them in time? What if we're the last ones left?" "We can't think like that," Emily said firmly. "We need to focus. We have to hold this building and gather everyone we can. We can't let panic take over." The barricades creaked as the mob continued to push against them. Outside, Emily could hear shouts of terror and confusion, the sound of the infected mingling with cries of the frightened townsfolk. "Let's move," Jennings ordered. "We need to make sure everyone who's still safe can get in here. Emily, you help barricade the windows. Jim, you're with me." As they worked to reinforce their defenses, Emily's mind raced with questions. What had caused this outbreak? Why had it started here? The medical reports she'd gathered only scratched the surface. The answers felt just out of reach, lost amidst the chaos. "We need a plan," Emily said, turning to Mayor Hart. "If we can figure out how this is spreading, maybe we can stop it. We need to find out where it started." "Agreed," Hart replied, her eyes resolute. "But first, we need to survive the night. Once we secure the center, we can gather information and regroup." As the group continued to fortify their position, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung in the air. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging Cedar Grove into darkness. Shadows crept across the room, amplifying the tension. Suddenly, the power flickered, plunging them into semi-darkness. The only sounds were the muffled growls of the infected and the labored breaths of the townsfolk within the community center. Panic surged anew as the realization set in. They were trapped, and the night was just beginning. The fight for survival had truly begun, and Emily knew they would need every ounce of strength to face the horrors lurking beyond their barricades. But with hope waning and fear mounting, the stakes had never been higher. Cedar Grove's fate now rested on their shoulders, and the first attack was only the beginning. As the darkness deepened, Emily steeled herself for what lay ahead. They had to hold on, for the sake of their town, for each other, and for the hope that they could uncover the truth behind this terrifying outbreak. In the days following the first reported outbreak, the once quiet town of Ridgeville descended into chaos. The air, once filled with the tranquil sounds of nature, was now thick with tension and fear. News spread fast, faster than anyone could have imagined. Panic rippled through the streets like wildfire as the infection rate doubled, tripled, and soon spiraled out of control. Within days, Ridgeville was a shadow of its former self. Sheriff Jennings, an authoritative figure with a calm demeanor, had no choice but to declare a full lockdown. The local authorities, already stretched thin, were forced to establish a strict curfew, mandating that all residents stay indoors from dusk till dawn. The town, under normal circumstances filled with the lively hum of daily routines, became eerily silent, save for the occasional distant scream or the foreboding sound of shuffling footsteps in the night. Streets that had once been filled with laughter and activity now stood deserted, with only the brave, or the foolish, daring to venture out into the open. Sheriff Jennings took to the town hall, broadcasting messages through every available channel. Stay inside. Lock your doors and windows. Do not engage with anyone you suspect to be infected. His voice, once full of conviction, now betrayed the weight of the situation. He knew the virus was spreading too fast, faster than any containment measures could hope to stop it. The town had never seen anything like this before, and the sheriff himself was struggling to keep it together. Emily, meanwhile, had taken refuge in her small, cluttered lab. She was a scientist, though her area of expertise lay far from epidemiology. But desperate times called for desperate measures. Emily knew that if anyone had a shot at solving this, it would have to be her. She worked tirelessly, her mind racing to find some semblance of understanding in the chaos. At first, she believed it to be a viral outbreak, some new strain of flu or rabies. The symptoms were there: fever, delirium, and aggression. But this was different, far different. The infected didn't just fall ill. They turned, almost as if they had become something else, something monstrous. The way their eyes glazed over, their skin paled, and their movements became erratic and unnatural. These weren't just sick people, they were becoming something more dangerous. Emily turned to the town's records, scouring medical files, historical data, anything that might give her a clue. But nothing matched. The virus seemed completely new. It wasn't until a few days later, while digging through old library records, that Emily came across something curious. The library, long forgotten by most of Ridgeville's residents, was an ancient building filled with dusty shelves and yellowing pages. It had an air of mystery, its towering bookshelves holding secrets no one had thought to unlock for decades. In the back, hidden among piles of outdated medical journals and forgotten manuscripts, Emily found a series of documents dating back to the town's founding. The documents spoke of an ancient pathogen, one long thought eradicated. It had been discovered centuries ago, during a time when the town's early settlers had encountered a strange illness after drinking from the river. At first, they thought it was simply bad water, tainted by some natural phenomenon. But soon, they realized it was far worse than that. The settlers had described a sickness that consumed its victims, transforming them into mindless, aggressive creatures. They noted how the infected became almost rabid, driven by some primal urge to attack and spread the disease. It had taken years for the town to recover, with the help of outside doctors and a forced quarantine. Eventually, the pathogen seemed to disappear, and the incident was largely forgotten, relegated to the annals of history as a strange but isolated event. Emily's heart pounded as she read through the dusty pages. The symptoms described were eerily similar to what she was seeing now. Could it be that this ancient pathogen had resurfaced? And if so, how? She continued to read, piecing together what little information the settlers had left behind. One passage caught her attention. The settlers had discovered that the source of the infection had come from the water supply. Specifically, it seemed to thrive in areas where the water had been contaminated by certain environmental changes. At the time, the settlers believed it had something to do with the nearby mines, which had polluted the river. They had tried to contain the spread by avoiding the water, but by then, it had already taken hold. Emily's mind raced. Ridgeville had recently undergone several environmental changes, none more significant than the construction of the new factory on the outskirts of town. The factory had been controversial from the start, with many residents concerned about its impact on the local environment. Could it be that the factory's waste had contaminated the water supply, reawakening this ancient pathogen? It was a terrifying thought, but it made sense. Emily knew she had to act quickly. She gathered what she could from the old library, taking notes and scanning the most important passages. She needed to get this information to the sheriff, to warn him that the water supply could be the key to stopping the spread. But as she left the library, her eyes scanning the darkened streets, she knew that time was running out. The infected were everywhere now, shambling through the town like lost souls. The once familiar faces of her neighbors were now twisted into grotesque masks of hunger and rage. The curfew had done little to stop the virus's spread, and Emily feared it was already too late to save Ridgeville. Back at her lab, Emily dove into her work, determined to find a solution. She tested the town's water supply, running sample after sample through her equipment. What she found confirmed her worst fears. The water was indeed contaminated, and the pathogen, once dormant, had reawakened due to the environmental changes brought on by the factory. Desperation clawed at her, but she couldn't give up. If she could isolate the pathogen, perhaps she could develop a way to neutralize it. Days passed, and the town continued to fall apart around her. The streets were now ruled by the infected, and those who hadn't yet turned were either hiding in fear or trying to escape. But there was no escaping this. The virus was spreading too quickly, and soon there would be no one left to save. Sheriff Jennings did what he could to maintain order, but even he knew the situation was slipping out of control. The infected had become too numerous, and his deputies were overwhelmed. There were reports of violence, looting, and worse. People were turning on each other in their desperation to survive. Emily's exhaustion was beginning to take its toll, but she couldn't afford to stop. She was close, so close, to finding an answer. Then, one night, as she pored over her notes, a breakthrough came. The pathogen, she realized, had a weakness. It couldn't survive in certain chemical environments. If she could introduce the right compound into the water supply, she might be able to stop the virus in its tracks. She hurried to prepare the antidote, knowing she didn't have much time. The sun was setting, and soon the streets would be filled with the infected once more. She had to act quickly. With the antidote in hand, she made her way to the town's main water treatment plant. It was a dangerous journey, but she had no choice. As she arrived, she was greeted by a horrifying sight. The infected were already there, swarming the plant, drawn by the sound of the water. She would have to fight her way through, but Emily was no fighter. Her hands shook as she gripped the small vial of antidote, knowing it was Ridgeville's only hope. With a deep breath, she steeled herself and entered the plant. The final battle for Ridgeville's survival had begun.